Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to talk about ransomware protection and 100% OpEx ransomware protection in particular with Zadara and Veeam. This topic, ransomware, is certainly a hot one these days. I don't think you can go a day without seeing a news article about ransomware or some attack and a company being held hostage. So obviously it's on all of our minds. We want to find ways to protect our organizations. And we're going to talk today about some of the evolving threats. We're going to talk today about ways to protect your organization that you may or may not have heard of before, and we hope you'll find it useful. So let's dive right in. I'd like to start by saying I'm Greg Newman. I'm VP Marketing at Zadara. Welcome, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by two experts, Corinne Bassett, technologist in the Product Strategy Group at Veeam. Hi, Corinne.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. Steve Costigan, our own Senior Director of International Solution Architects at Zadara. Hi, Steve.
Hey, Greg. Nice to be here. Looking forward to this session.
Excellent. Yes, I think our audience is looking forward to it as well. There's a lot to cover. Let me show you an agenda, everyone, so you know where we're at and where we're going to be going today. We're going to talk a little bit about IT security and what we like to call a balanced approach. You'll learn more about that. Resource isolation is really a key when you're looking to protect against something like ransomware, and we'll talk about that. And talking about protection at the app layer, we're going to show you 32110, the zip code. I think you're going to find that really interesting if you've never seen that before. Immutability, that's a word, those of you who've just learned that word, and a lot of us have, because it's a bit new in the lexicon. We're going to learn more about that, and we'll talk a little bit about VCSPs. And then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. In fact, we may even have time for Q&A during the course of this presentation. So my recommendation is if you have questions while we're going through this, please use the questions panel inside of your GoToWebinar control panel, and our experts will attempt to get to those questions throughout the course of the presentation. If we don't get to your questions either during the presentation or in our Q&A session afterward, we will do our best to follow up, make sure we get answers to everybody's questions. This webinar is being recorded, so if you miss something or if you don't have a chance to stick around, you will get a chance to hear the recording. All right, so there you go. That's a little housekeeping. Let's dive right in. Steve Costigan, I'd like to hand it to you. Let's talk a little bit about ransomware, huh?
Hey, Greg, thanks. So we want to highlight what's really happening in the market space out there, in terms of, every day we see a new ransomware attack, somebody being compromised. And, there's been some pretty big cases out there across the last 12, 18 months. And, I want to highlight Norsk Hydro, because this is one of the few that have gone public with their experience and the full impact to their organization. 35,000 employees across 40 countries, unable to operate. But the key thing around this attack is that the infiltrators were able to gain access weeks before actually triggering the attack, and the impact was that over a month later they were still recovering. And this was a relatively unique environment in that even the AV vendors were unable to detect the Lokagoga environment at that point. Now, the full impact of this, is estimated between $61 and $72 million in terms of full impact to Norsk Hydro. If we look at other ransomware attacks that we've seen in recent months, this attack onto Travelex over the Christmas period in 2019 meant that for a lot of people, they were unable to provide or gain access to travel money exchange. A lot of the UK banks were dependent upon Travelex for their online currency exchange, and this went pretty vocal in terms of a worldwide impact in terms of what people were seeing around ransomware attacks and the way that the threat index has changed. Here, the Revil attack was threatening not only to encrypt the data, which it had done, but also threatening to dump this data if the ransomware wasn't actually paid. Now, this means that there's a GDPR impact in doing that, whereby they have to report what data was compromised, what's out in the field. And another key area around this was that not only did they encrypt, not only did they extract data, but they actually deleted the backup data as part of this. So this was quite a comprehensive, end-to-end attack vector, which forced Travelex to pay a $2.3 million ransom. And the latter impacts, recently within the last month, we've seen that Travelex is now up for sale. So the impacts to an organization can be quite severe here in terms of what we see from ransomware. Now, in terms of what we're seeing as a trend, this trend is continuing to rise in terms of the global cost. We're seeing this go up from 325 million in 2015 all the way to an expected $20 billion plus within the next 12, 18 months. So this is an exponential threat vector that we just cannot ignore. So what can we do about it? Well, if we look at the ways that we need to be thinking about ransomware and how we can mitigate the risks, the number one priority really has to be educate your users, educate people around those key vulnerabilities, security training, making sure that your organization end to end understands that people need to be educated. And then, on top of that, limit access, make sure that people can only access the information that they need to access, make sure that they haven't just got global admin rights to everything, because a lot of the ransomware attacks, they rely on administrative access to systems to be able to exploit. So if you lock that down, then you can provide some key restrictions there in limiting the effect. But it's about building layers. So making sure that you've got end protection in terms of endpoint protection, all of your devices, email gateways, everything throughout your environment, you have to build a layered system. The more complex that it is for an attacker to get through your systems, the more they're going to look for an easier attack vector. On top of that, we see patch vulnerabilities. Travelex, were an organization that failed to patch their environment properly. They were warned about it. They didn't act upon that in good time. They paid the price for that in more ways than one. But it's inevitable as we look through this, we'll see that organizations are going to suffer from attacks. And at some point, you need to ensure that if you are compromised, that you can recover from that environment. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is how you mitigate the risks from a backup and a recovery perspective, as well as trying to educate you on some of these facts that we're seeing moving forward. So in terms of the security balanced approach, this is around what the industry calls CIA, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality of ensuring that the data is maintained in a way that people only have access to the information that they need to have access to and no more, and ensuring that that data has integrity, it's not being compromised by either bad actors or malware in some way or other. But at the same time, ensuring that you have availability so that users can access those systems. Again, if you make it too restrictive, then the problem is that it becomes unusable. People will find different ways of interacting. We've all seen those those case studies of people putting post-it notes on their desktop and underneath keyboards with passwords. So people will find a way around it if we make it too difficult. So in terms of those ransomware entry points, what are we actually seeing out there in the wild? Well, phishing is probably the number one attack vector that we're seeing. And we're seeing that, especially what we've seen over the last few months, people are working from home, the increase in phishing attacks is out there. We're seeing that every single day. And this is probably the most common way that these ransomware actors are embedding into their emails malware, using social engineering And this means that people are opening a email, compromising their internal systems, and then enabling an attack vector from inside. But additionally, because we're seeing more and more remote users, more and more people using remote desktop protocol, that means a lot of those endpoints are being exposed onto the internet. And we're seeing these attacks, up to 1 million attacks a day onto RDP endpoints. So we're talking about VDI access because they need access into the central system. But on top of that, software vulnerabilities, bugs are always going to be out there. We're going to run across 0-day impact bugs. These may be known by attackers, but may not be known by the owners of the systems. And a real big area is user error. And Corinne, you've got an interesting piece around a user error and how it impacted an organization.
Yeah, it's not always just your end users that you have to worry about. We're all human and we all make mistakes. And in this case, it was an administrator that realized a phishing email had made it through the filter, took the proper steps to alert everyone saying, hey, this message just came through. Here's a screenshot of what that message looks like. Please do click on that link, is what the email read, instead of saying do not click on that link. And immediately, once you've realized that, you're going back and retracting, but that time frame where an administrator was telling you to click on that link because your end user may not really understand what phishing is, you've opened up a point of entry that someone above you is telling you to click on this link.
So it's an important piece, in terms of somebody just gaining the wrong information. And there's organizations out there that can help us protect. And I know, Corinne, you talk about KnowBe4 and their use case and what they do. Do you want to explain a little bit more on what they do and how they do it?
Yeah, KnowBe4 is an excellent point of reference. They hold webinars all the time with different vendors and security appliances and how they apply to those vendors and what those vendors can do for you. So there, a lot of the times there's built-in applications or security vectors that you can place into what's already in your infrastructure, and they help you figure out what that could be. And the other one that I really like here is GoFish. Phishing is one of the biggest attack vectors in an infrastructure because everyone thinks their spam filter is going to catch everything. So what GoFish does is it will allow you to send out an email to everyone in your infrastructure with a link. And anyone that clicks that link, you'll get a feedback of how many people in your organization actually clicked the link that looks suspicious without actually infecting your environment. So you can send out those reminders to people saying, don't do this. You tested and you failed.
So this is a key part of that education piece that we were talking about earlier, in terms of just making people think about what they're doing, not just, misreading an email or just doing things because they think they're doing things the right way, actually testing that capability is actually happening. So it's interesting that we look at those attack vectors, and we see them in many different ways across different organizations. Everybody seems to think that the attack vector is just an internet-based threat coming from bad actors out on the internet. And while there are a great number of those, and the exposure of remote desktop protocol, as we've seen through a firewall, means that if you're not using multi-factor authentication, then that could be a very simple and easy compromise. But there's other attack points. People forget about their Wi-Fi. Drive-by attacks. Somebody sat outside the organization, actually constantly sat there trying to get into the Wi-Fi networks and trying to compromise those keys. So again, multi-factor authentication, even at that level, is something to think about in terms of an attack vector. The other one that we see a great deal of is around email servers. And I read an interesting article. I actually published it on LinkedIn from the UK government. And there was a piece of work and a study that was done around a severity 10 impacting CVE against Microsoft Exchange. And what they diagnosed was that there's over 350,000 email servers that are unpatched, that are exposing their email environment, their Exchange environment, that enables them to gain full control of that environment. That's a frightening statistic in terms of those numbers. But it's not just external actors. There's a great deal of compromises that may also happen from internal actors, internal bad actors that get inside your environment. Maybe they're compromised people, maybe they're looking to leave, maybe they've got issues around where they're going in their jobs. But another important aspect is not only protecting your environment, but also ensuring that your backup mechanism is also outside of that attack vector. So trying to isolate your network, isolate your backup network is a key part of eliminating these threats. So in eliminating these threats, what Zadara recommends is that you try and isolate wherever possible. Try and isolate from a network perspective. We provide our virtual private storage arrays in a way that allows us to isolate physical storage logically, right the way down with disk isolation between tenant or virtual arrays. Provide an out-of-band management system so that the management network is not sat on the same network as your users. And part of what we've introduced with our latest release is this ability of VNI. So to have non-routable networks where you can create network shares that are not available outside the layer 2 network. So again, it's about providing this air-gapped architecture of only allowing minimal systems to gain access where required. And in terms of looking at that multi-tenant isolation capability that Zadara brings into the market space, it's about providing dedicated CPU cores, dedicated memory, dedicated network resources, drives and SSD cache. So even though we have a common platform, we're able to completely segregate and isolate storage resources, scale them up, scale them down, scale them out. So provide all of the things that you need in terms of maintaining integrity and availability, but at the same time, maintaining confidentiality. So in terms of that separation from a networking perspective, I talked about that use of VNIs, and this is a representation of how Zadara would recommend that you look at your networking, and certainly from a storage perspective, isolating primary networks and application servers from secondary networks and users, and limiting access wherever possible. This ability that we have of completely isolating, even from small number of drives to large-scale systems, enables a different vector of separation. And then additionally, there's this concept of separating your backup network and providing a capability where you're able to isolate your backups from attack as well. And Corinne, I think this is an interesting point where Veeam obviously provides a great wealth of features and functionality, and it's probably worth handing over to you at this point to explain some of those things.
Yeah. So Veeam is a platform of all kinds of services because your infrastructure probably isn't just virtual machines. It's not just endpoints or physical servers. And you also likely are in the cloud in some way, shape, or form. Office 365 is exploding in the field right now, with Teams allowing you to be collaborative. You have your virtual machines for distributed workloads, and even maybe a cloud infrastructure. Our platform allows you to cover all of those vectors so that you're able to get them in the same format and make them extremely portable, which is a large part of the conversation, not only being able to back up, but having a centralized way to be able to restore that. And then, of course, with Zadara, they get to offer you the backup as a service and DR as a service. So it takes a whole nother complexity out of that factor for you.
Okay, and Kareem, you mentioned that restore piece. That I noticed that there's a piece about data labs in there. What does data labs actually enable us to do in that area?
Data labs is a way to spin up an isolated environment from your existing backup files. So we get to emulate that into an area where you can do any type of testing. You can scan it with antivirus. With that same type of technology, you can give it to a set of administrators that even need to do patch and update testing. It's pretty much limitless based on what you need to do in your environment or what you want to test in your environment before you push it into production.
Okay, so that leads us on very nicely to what we talked about in our last one around the Office 365. You came up with this great acronym, the data protection zip code. Do you want to take everyone through that methodology and what that means?
Yeah, so it almost looks like we're just adding numbers for the fun of it, but everyone should be very familiar with the beginning. You need at least 3 copies of your data on 2 different media types, and one of those should be offsite in case of physical disaster. But we found that that's not exactly enough, and that doesn't cover you completely. So we've added an additional type of data retention, which is to have either what we call a mutable or an air-gapped drive, meaning that you're not able to touch it through any type of protocol to modify that data or alter that data to be able to restore it. And then we come to what we were just talking about earlier, which is our data lab. So being able to test your backups to verify that they're going to be able to recover. And you can also scan with antivirus these backups to make sure you're not just exasperating the issue by pushing that virus back out into the infrastructure again. So we've gone a step further to make sure not only are your backups available, but the integrity of your backups are also just important.
Okay, and that's a key part of really where we believe this 100% OpEx model, this 32110 capability between Zadara and Veeam, we believe is a unique in the market space because it gives the ability of combining both products and to offer all of the great capabilities that Veeam bring in terms of primary backup and using that secondary storage capability and our object storage capability to create a cloud tier scale out backup repository, but also the nice features that additional air gap capability that Veeam brings via the VCSPs. So those VCSP partners, cloud providers, also utilizing the same immutability capability, are able to offer immutability and an air gap, whereby even if there's an internal compromise, maybe on the client side, somebody deletes the backup, as we saw with Travelex, having an immutable backup means that there's a recovery point that is not easily accessible from a bad actor who's looking to delete those backups. So that brings us up into that capacity tier, Kareem, and what does that mean from a Veeam perspective in terms of what have you introduced with Object Lock?
So Amazon AWS storage has an additional feature, as you just mentioned, which is the object lock. This object lock allows you to do exactly what Worm did when it came to tape. Write once, read many. And the funny thing is, whenever you enable the object lock on the S3 storage through Amazon, it actually says this emulates the same exact concept as Worm did in tape infrastructures. We've taken that same technology and implemented it into our capacity tier, which we've created a technology vector called immutability or data immutability, meaning that whenever you write anything to this capacity tier, no one else can alter that data. You can only write it once, and it'll stay there for whatever retention period that you want. You can't modify it, your administrators can't modify it, no one from Amazon can modify this data. And you can restore anything from it as many times as you want to restore from it, and the lock never expires. So you retain that data as long as you've put that expiration date on that file, which I think has created a new game when it comes to cloud infrastructures. We don't need tape. We have the other option to do cloud.
Okay, and there's an interesting aspect around that, because obviously Zadara has a key affinity to service providers. Those service providers are able to provide that same object lock capability on Zadara's object storage. So even though you can utilize an Amazon S3 bucket, there's obviously key things around that about egress charges, etc., whereby an MSP providing that same capability, that same object storage capability inside their own facility, utilizing Zadara, means that they're able to deliver this capacity tier as an end-to-end, as a true multi-tier capability from utilizing block, NAS, and object using Zadara. So it's not just about an S3 capacity tier, but also a Zadara-enabled capacity tier as well. So in terms of where we see things around the restore, Karine, and a key element that we've been talking about is not just about backups, is it? It's the ability to ensure that you can deliver a restore. Why is that important?
That's important because why are you doing backups in the first place? In case you need to be able to restore that data. And taking that a little bit a step further, a term that we hear a lot, zero-day risk, zero-day viruses. Now, what we've also determined is 0-day doesn't mean that's when it was also installed on your machine. 0-day means that's when we discovered it to be able to exploit it as people that need to learn how to protect it. So we have these time-bombed based ransomware, so in the infrastructure that was installed at a particular date that we're probably not aware of. So as our product, we have offered a new ability which is called Secure Restore, meaning that you're able to scan those backups prior to being restored and pushing out to your environment to make sure the file that you're looking at currently that caught that 0-day virus or that hash code for that virus, we can scan the previous day files or the previous hours files, depending on whatever your cycle is, to be able to know for sure that we're not just pushing that back out into the environment. And these windows of when you've been infected are sometimes impossible to know without checking. And that's where I think this software becomes invaluable.
So in our last webinar, Karine, we talked about Schrodinger's backup, and it's a recurring theme, isn't it? In terms of if you never open the backup, how do you know that it's valid? How do you know that you can actually recover from that? And we see an interesting point here happening in that we talk about 32110 and this ability to ensure that you've got an offline copy, and Cloud Connect brings a very interesting part to that offline copy piece. But I think if we combine the secure backup, the data labs capability, and if a service provider is then able to offer a service where they're scanning those backups for an organization, they may be able to offer additional value add, obviously as a chargeable, but that may provide an interesting insurance metric. It's certainly probably going to be a better metric than paying the ransomware attackers, because they've compromised your backups and your systems. And where we feel that Zadara adds real value here is this ability to offer the scale-out backup repository and that immutable storage at an object layer, but also to be able to present a new storage array instantaneously, i.e. 90 seconds. A new storage array can be presented from the VCSP. That can be utilized into a data labs environment for restores. That testing can happen. And because the customer or the service provider is paying on a per hour basis, that means they're able to do this as a service. They've not got to try and provision storage up front that they may or may not be selling or utilizing for the long term. So this is a key differentiator of where Zadara and Veeam, and certainly a service provider, is able to take advantage of these concepts, and even enterprise customers. If you're trying to be a service provider within your own enterprise, this OpEx driven model enables you to do things in a very, very different way. And if we look a little bit further, we look at the enterprise, and it's not just external attack vectors, is it, Karine? We see different things happening, and Veeam have introduced some other key aspects, I believe, in terms of managing against malicious employees.
I would say it's not even just malicious, but even misguided employees create a threat against your infrastructure. Your IT admin wears so many hats anymore. It may just be a mistake, or if you've hired someone that they really haven't been performing and they know they're on their way out, there's definitely that malicious employee factor. And if all of your infrastructure and your backups are on-prem, then that administrator has access to everything. When you're using a backup or a VCC provider, you're able to have an additional site, an additional level of authentication and security to those backups.
Okay, so again, that's an interesting dynamic, and I suppose this is where again we're going to drive back into that 100% OpEx and using the service provider delivery model. Part of the reason why we're emphasizing this is because as you mentioned there, Karine, people are now having to wear many different hats, aren't they? They're having to put on the server hat and the application hat and the networking hat, and they may not actually be backup specialists. So when you've got a Veeam VCSP who's a specialist in delivering backup and restores and being a data backup specialist, it means that you're able to actually maybe aggregate and take some of the benefits of their aggregation in terms of their personnel and their specialized personnel to offer offsite backup using either the shared tenancy and the multi-tenancy built into Veeam, or using a dedicated tenancy whereby some customers may be large enough, may just want to ensure that they're not only their physical storage, but their backup environment is completely dedicated. And then back to that data labs piece we were talking about earlier on, this ability to offer storage on demand and present that to data labs. And again, combining this as a completely OpEx model, not trying to predict 2, 3, 4, 5 years in advance what storage you're going to need, because how do you know? How does anybody know what storage they're going to need 3 months, 6 months in advance? It's really, really impossible to try and predict that. I think these days, having a scalable model certainly helps. So in terms of those service providers and providing data protection as a service, I want to talk about one of my important customers. SANS, based in the Philippines. They provide a full data protection service, backup, disaster recovery, archive, but they deploy across multiple tiers and multiple environments. So, Karine talked about this ability for Veeam to operate, in the public cloud via service providers, on premises. Zadara provides exactly those same mirrored capabilities, and this is where an organization like SANS can really, take their expertise in backup and disaster recovery and archive capabilities to ensure that you as a customer are able to make decisions about your data protection, whether you're on premises, in the cloud, or a hybrid between two. And they're able to deliver this in a 100% OpEx model because of the combination of Zadara and Veeam together. And when we look at this 100% OpEx ransomware protection, it's not just about what Zadara and Veeam do, it's also about what you do, okay? Your training and your understanding of the threat environments. But it's also important to ensure that you have multi-tier capabilities, that you have this ability to have separation, that you can isolate and you can have data immutability with object lock, okay? And you need to make sure that it is, they're able to plug together. Zadara is being ready on object and repository, and this ability to offer multi-tenancy, whether it's on premises or whether it's via a service provider, it's exactly the same delivery model from a Zadara perspective. So if you're on premises and you're using Veeam universal licenses, it's OpEx with Zadara. If you're a VCSP and you're using it with Zadara, it's OpEx. And this is where it enables you to have complete fluidity in size, scale, and where you go forward and where you go backwards. And in terms of thinking about your organization, you've got to think about how you protect that organization. And Kareem, we've discussed this many times over the last few days, and you came up with the first one, which was have a plan. Why is having a plan so important?
I think having a plan is not just important to have that plan to know what you're going to do, but that plan means you've thought out what if this happens, means that you've considered all of those attack vectors, means that you've decided that you're going to monitor what's going on. And often enough, if you have a plan, you're actually going to get to test that plan instead of never testing and just throwing solutions out at the problem without knowing if it'll ever work. I think plan is the number one step, and then testing that plan is your next.
Okay, so fail to plan to fail. Maybe. Okay, so another one is, obviously we've talked about patching your systems, and we've talked about those 350,000 Exchange servers out there that are still unpatched. We see critical CVEs from many organizations out there on a continual basis. And it's important that the time to patching is getting better because of automation, okay? But they're still out there. Those zero-day attacks are still going to be there, but you still have to maintain your patching. The next one is endpoint protections. Kareem, do you want to take that one on why it's important?
Because you have a lot of users. Patching your system and endpoint protection, I would say, may even go hand in hand when you're considering all those security vulnerabilities. And if your antivirus isn't up to date on those endpoints, you have so many attack vectors. And especially with this work at home life that we're working with right now, a lot of those machines aren't on the company domain, meaning that they're not being required to get updated through any type of Windows update policy. And IPS and any type of detection system on endpoint machines are just not there as much as we'd like to see. And that's just a huge security vulnerability.
Okay, and I suppose you touched on an important thing there in terms of new devices, not being on the corporate device list. This move to bring your own device, does that also have a threat in this environment for endpoint protection?
Yes, and I think assuming that someone's not going to use their own device anymore can be even more in danger, or even more in danger in an environment than accepting people are going to bring their own devices. And I've been reading a lot more articles lately where corporations are creating a network just for people to bring their own devices so that they're not trying to find a way to connect to a secure line inside the organization. Remote devices and bring your own devices, I don't see those going away.
Okay, so then that leads us on to the next one, which is educate people as being even more important, would you say, from where we've been? If we're looking at bring your own device, is that education? We talked about Go Fish and all of those others. Does that bring this to the fore even more?
I'd say so. I mean, your biggest vulnerability is always going to be people, and the more educated your end users are, the less likely they are to do something that they shouldn't. Having even just a yearly corporate reminder saying, hey, these are the things that we don't allow, these are the reasons why, because sometimes people need a good reason why. Education with all of the facts is very important, and then testing the end users' education and what they know with tools like Go Fish can be invaluable to know if your employees are actually at the level where you need them to be to have the most secure environment, because it only takes one.
Okay, so it is an interesting point you raised there, because a lot of organizations only put their employees through the security training once a year. Is that enough, or do we have to try and reinforce this on a more regular basis?
I think that we need more than training. I think we need to have simulations for any other type of disaster that happens in a company, whether it's a tornado drill, fire drill, whatever. I bet most employees could tell you I have to go out that exit.
Okay.
But it's just as dangerous to an environment and your business as a whole and the livelihoods, because if you've lost your business, like the exchange we were talking about earlier, they're having to sell their company because of a security breach.
Yeah.
It is just as critical to everyone's day of life to know these policies and make sure that they're not going to create a security vulnerability that leaves you open in the end.
Okay, so that leads us on to the next one in terms of passwords and the way people store passwords or utilize passwords. And one of the key elements of reducing that is to use multi-factor authentication. Pretty much most systems now will support one-time passwords or integration with biometrics. I suppose when we look at from a backup perspective, is it important to ensure that even for the Veeam side of things that we implement some sort of authentication and multi-factor authentication from that perspective?
I would say that with it coming to Veeam and authentication processes and this factor, that it comes down to least privilege. You don't want to be using the same accounts everywhere because not every account can be authenticated with a multi-factor authentication, unfortunately, because that includes a human element, meaning that every time your backup runs, are you going to have an administrator there exactly at each time that you want those backups to run to authenticate? So you have to be mindful of who is also using that account, maybe isolating so this account only has access to Veeam components, and then you lock down where it can't access anything else in your infrastructure. It can't log into 80 as an administrator to gain access to passwords. Least
So
privilege, I think,
that's an important part then, isn't it? Not just thinking multi-factor is the answer, but actually truly thinking about each of your layers and what can and can't be done for a best practice.
Exactly.
So that leads us on to, back to the zip code, back to that air gap, back to that separation, and really ensuring that you've got 3 copies, 2 different media, 1 offsite, 1 offline. Check your restores, because if you don't check your restores, you don't really know that you can recover. And from a ransomware attack, is it fair to say that your backup and restore is your last line of attack, last point of recovery?
I would say, yeah, Protecting your environment and doing everything you can, but plan for the worst day is where that comes in. And I'd actually like to expand on these 32110 because even just a couple years ago, 321 was what everyone was talking about. And if you do any type of research out on the web on different types of rules to protect your environment, what is impenetrable in a sense, you find different answers to this solution. But I would say not just sticking with knowing that, oh, now I know the 32110 rule, I'll never need something else to think about is incorrect. There are all kinds of ransomware out there and evolving ransomware, and this rule is going to evolve over time depending on the types of ransomware that hit the environment. There's a ransomware out there right now which attaches itself to external drives on machines, and as soon as you plug those drives back into a machine, so if you're storing your backups, it corrupts what's ever on that drive when it's told to be triggered. So even air-gapped hard drives have a scary attack vector that only layers can help protect.
Okay, is that the Ramsey one?
It might be. I think that might be the term for it. There's so many types of
Different ones
ransomware
every
out there
single
anymore.
day.
I know.
So that then leads on to the next piece, which is, it's okay having all of these systems, but if you don't monitor and test, then they're pretty much useless. Do we have any ways to help in terms of monitor and test?
Yeah, being vigilant, excuse me, in your environment and knowing your environment is the step one, because you're not going to know what to monitor unless you know what's out there. And Veeam offers something called Veeam One, which can help you monitor your infrastructures and make sure that your backup processes are kicking off successfully. But going that step further and testing those backups, that just loops back to that whole data labs conversation that we were talking about earlier, running automated tests on your backups to make sure that they can recover. Whenever you boot up your machine, is the application going to be available? Or is there some specific state that you have on maybe an Oracle machine, you have to run a script to take it into an online mode for the database? When you're scrambling to do that on the day that you need that data, it seems like a lot longer than testing it prior and already having the answer when it comes up.
Okay, so again, this key element of it, what we're talking about here is about that multi-layered approach and how it's all of these things, not just one of them. And back to that very first comment you made about have a plan, and then the last bit, make sure you monitor and test that plan works and repeatedly go through that. So in terms of really we're at the end of this session. Hopefully people have been able to get a good feeling for really where we feel that Zadara and Veeam contribute to that recovery mechanism, but also maybe highlight some of the other areas that maybe you've got to think about that maybe you've not considered. If you do want to know more, please come and talk to us. We've got another webinar scheduled for 2nd of June, where we're going to start to talk about some of the other new advancements from Veeam around NAS backup and how Zadara plays into that, and how bringing the NAS with the ransomware and object, Office 365 and all of these things together provide a complete end-to-end backup and disaster recovery strategy. And then on top of that, Veeam On is coming June 17th, 18th. It's virtual. Zadara is proud to be presenting at that, and we have a virtual booth. So please come and see what we're talking about. Hopefully, we'll be able to give you some more interesting information. So with that, Greg, I'm probably going to hand back over to you. Do we have any questions or anything that we want to highlight?
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Corinne. I really enjoyed listening to your presentation. I felt like we got a really comprehensive view of the topic, and I think we can see that there's certainly a number of factors to consider when you're protecting against ransomware. We do have some questions, and we have some time for some questions. So let's dive in. There's an interesting question here about the OpEx model. How does that typically look, this person asks? Replacing a CapEx model with a minimal recurring OpEx, what would happen in the event of a restore? Is there a larger usage bill in the event of a restore?
I suppose it depends on how you look at things. You know, if you're restoring over from your existing environment, then it's the same storage.
Right.
And there's another interesting aspect here is, you know, let's say you've got to do a complete full restore, and let's say you don't understand whether your data's, you know, your NAS or whatever running on Zadara is compromised. Then, you know, you can delete that VPSA, create a completely new one, completely fresh, and then do a restore onto that. So you pay per hour, for the drives and the controllers. So it gives you, you know, lots of flexibility in terms of being able to utilize the best of both Zadara and Veeam. You know, Veeam are not going to charge you anymore for doing a restore. We're going to charge per hour for the data or the drives that are in use and the controllers are in use. So, you know, if you were to only use it for a restore, for a test restore, for example. So let's take that data labs environment. So let's say you create a VPSA with 2 controllers, and let's say you put 20 drives into that environment, and you run that for a day, and then you test everything, you're satisfied, you run all of your testing, and then you want to collapse that down. Okay, so from a data labs perspective, you know, you're going to tear that down from within Veeam, and then the storage, you're simply going to tear that VPSA down, and the hour that you've torn that down, you're going to stop paying for those resources. Now, there's another angle to this, which is, what if you've done that testing and it's Friday afternoon, and you know that you need to do some further testing, but you want to do that on Monday? Zadara gives you a really, really unique here, in that you can actually hibernate the VPSA controllers. So you stop paying for the controllers at that point. Okay, you're still paying for the drives because they're allocated. But when you think of, you know, a storage service that enables you to stop paying for, you know, the resource that you're not consuming at that point, that's a very, very unique in the industry. There's only Zadara does that. So hopefully that answers the, you know, am I going to pay more or less from an OpEx perspective, because on a restore, because if you're overwriting the existing, no, you're not. If you're creating something new, then you're going to be billed just for that period.
There's another angle to this question, at least I read into this question, Steve. It's the idea, maybe when this questioner talks about usage fees, I wonder if they're thinking about egress fees.
Yeah, I mean, from a Zadara perspective, you know, we don't charge egress fees. You know, we're delivering typically, you know, from a rapid restore perspective, you know, if you're an enterprise customer, we'll be delivering the same Zadara goodness on premises. That could be delivered by a service provider or a partner, but it's the same model, and they could then be using Cloud Connect to their service provider, and their service provider can offer them exactly the same thing. And if the service provider doesn't charge for egress, then there's no egress fees. You know, a lot of the value add from the service providers that we work with, you know, they offer an all-encompassing system and don't charge for egress costs. You know, the piece last week, you know, we talked about around the Office 365 piece and virtual DCFs. You know, they don't charge for egress.
Yep. There's a question here. I'm not quite sure I understand, but let's tackle it. What if someone deletes the S3 object?
Good luck with that
S3
one.
object storage can't be deleted if object lock isn't enabled until all data on that object storage has fallen out of retention.
Yep.
So it's really key there is that as far as, you know, from the view of the user, that data has been deleted, i.e. the top layer. But there's a version underneath that Veeam can look into, and it can say that data is immutable I'm going to restore from that. And that's the whole part of this immutability. You cannot delete it.
Right, exactly. Well, we're getting near the end, and I know that we have on the screen here for everybody who's attending places to find more information, online resources. As Steve mentioned, we will be at Veeam. We're very excited. We have another webinar coming up in 2 weeks on June 2nd. You can see that on the screen there. It's for NAS backup, and we hope that if you've enjoyed today's webinar and on the topic of ransomware, that you will join us for NAS backup and learn a little bit more about how we tackle that important issue as well. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I'd especially like to thank our two experts today. Corinne, thank you very much for being a part of this.
Thank you for having me.
Steve Costigan, a pleasure as always, sir. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Greg. I've enjoyed it. Thanks, Kareem.
Thanks, everybody. See you at the next one. Bye-bye.